Privilege again, an honor to stand before you and discuss our great republic, which has withstood another year of enemies, foreign and domestic, still stands for freedom. With the exception of Israel, no doubt the most loved country and the most hated country ever. And that's because of some things that we'll talk about, but we know that this country was founded by Christian men and Christian families. And the world hates that because they hate God. So I'm going to give you a little review at the beginning here because it's important to our discussion today. But a couple of years ago, I discussed a man by the name of Patrick Henry. You may remember Patrick Henry was well known for his speech, which he gave, which we think of, "Give me liberty or give me death." That speech occurred on March 20th, 1775 in the state of Virginia as they were meeting to discuss this issue of the Revolution. And before his speech, most were very passive in this regard in Virginia. In attendance that day was George Washington as well as Thomas Jefferson and many other famous patriots. But Patrick Henry changed all that day by that speech. And you know, there are times, there are moments in history where God just uses a person, a man, and a word or an action and totally inspires a group of people. And that's what happened that day, March 20th. And during just a few things about his speech, will bring us up to our discussion today. But he reminded the colonists that they must fight. He said, "I repeat, sir, we must fight." He said, "The war is inevitable and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come." And this was in March 20th, 1775. Remember the date. That's important. As he turned his eyes, I would have loved to have seen that speech that day, Brother Doug. I mean, as I hear people describe it, it was very animated. It was very passionate. And the point of it was that, gentlemen, we must not remain idle. And at the end of it, you remember that he took his hands and he raised his hands and he, as they were chained together, and he says, "I know not what for other men." And as he said that, he dropped his left hand and took his right hand as if it held the sword. "But as for me, give me liberty." And then he paused to let those words sink in, and he said, "Or give me death." And there was no applause after his speech. There was nothing but silence. But there was resolve, and he was right. He said in that speech that day, he said that our countrymen, he said, "Gentlemen," he says, "they are already taking to the field." He said, "The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why should we be here idle?" And he's right. 30 days later, to the day, this would have been April 19th, 1975, about a little after midnight, about 1 a.m. in the morning, 3 men are in a room in Lexington, Massachusetts. 2 of them you well know. That was the 2 most hated men by the King of England. And the 2 that they said, he said he would pardon everyone else but these 2. These 2 he would not pardon. And that was John Hancock and Samuel Adams. But there was a 3rd man in that room with them that day. And that's what I want to focus on today, because nobody knows about him. But his name was Jonas Clark. I'm sure, and Brother Ed was in here, I know he's outside, but I would tell him, I know we're related, okay? I can't prove it by genealogy, but we're of the same cloth, let's put it that way. But he was a man. He was a preacher. He was the pastor of the church there in Lexington. And they were actually, these 3 men were in that country parsonage. He was safeguarding these 2 men that were enemies of England. And there was a famous writer that came that night. Y'all know who it was, don't you, young people? Who was the writer that made the famous ride that night? Paul Revere. He knocks on the door. They open the door. He comes in to tell them, and his purpose of that ride was to warn the colonists, but also to for sure tell Hancock and Adams so that they might escape. And he goes to that house specifically, and he tells them that they're on their way. At least 700 of Great Britain's military is marching up the road in their way. So now the decision comes, what do we do? And the captain, or should I say, actually, they had a committee of safety, and the chairman of that committee was John Hancock. It was his call. Do I call the militia out? And so he turns to the pastor. He turns to Jonas Clark, and he says, Pastor, will your people fight? And he replies, I assure you that I am well acquainted with the state of my flock. They will not only fight, but they would also be willing to lay down their lives for the cause of liberty. Hancock was convinced, and he called the militia out. Initially, when they were called out, nobody came, and so they sent them back home but to be alert. And the second time they called, it was certain that they were approaching. Now they were within a very short distance of the city. And so they called them out again. And talking about Clark's influence. Now listen, these are farmers. These are mill hands, okay? These are not soldiers, okay? But they had had some training. And they had had especially some spiritual training. And Pastor Clark had preached to them faithfully. And according to historians, this is what they said about his preaching. That earnestly he discussed from the pulpit the great questions at issue. And that with a powerful voice thundered forth the principles of personal, civil, and religious liberty. And the right of resistance in tones as earnest and as effective as he did the doctrines of salvation by the cross. So they call out the men. 17 men show up on the green that day in Lexington. What was their purpose there? Why were they there? They were there not to pick a fight with 700 British, but to show that they would not be passive and they would face a foe. And so when they came out that day, they were not to fire upon the British. They were only to defend themselves if they were fired upon. And so when the British saw them, the commanding officer that day, there was Colonel Smith and there was Major Pitcairn. And Pitcairn told them to drop your arms and to dismantle your force. And they did begin to disperse, but they didn't lay down their arms. And then there was a shot fired, and they call it the shot that was heard around the world, right? And if you read historians, they'll say that, it's not known who fired the shot. And some people even said that the pastor fired the shot. Well, in his message that he preached a year later than this event, he clearly said that it was the British that fired the shot. They were commanded not to fire the shot, but so were the British. But unfortunately, somebody got ambitious, and when the shot fired, of course, the fight broke out. Samuel Adams and John Hancock had retired to protect because of their position. They could not risk being captured, and they had moved about a mile away from the scene. And when they heard that, now remember, these guys are outnumbered 10-1, right? And they're against the most trained army in the world. And when these guns began to go off, Adams says to Hancock, he says, "Oh, what a glorious morning is this." And rightfully so, because they knew what must happen was happening. But this was Pastor Clark's firsthand view. The battle lasted about 15 minutes. And when it was over, there were 8 Americans that lay dead or dying. 9 more being wounded. And Pastor Clark had a firsthand view of the mangled parishioners, and it was anything but glorious. He said when the smoke cleared And he saw the dying men around the church property and the wounded. And by the way, the British losses that day were 2 slightly injured, and one of them was Pitcairn's horse. It wasn't much of a fight. One of the men that died was a Christian patriot named Jonathan Harrington Jr. He was writhing in agony as his wife watched from the window, observing the fight. She witnessed her husband get shot down, then rise to his feet, only to fall again. And when he crawled through his own blood on his hands and knees toward his house, Miss Harrington rushed to meet him, only to have him die at her feet. Clark described that morning, he said it was a bloody murder that had been committed. He gazed upon it and earnestly on this tragedy and this spectacle, but no tears of regret mingled with those of sympathy which he shed. These lifeless forms before him were holy martyrs in his sight. And he said they were the first precious sacrifices laid upon the altar of his country. Victims, he said, but he had no misgivings. And from this day, he said, will be dated the liberty of the world. So I'll leave you with the rest of the story. We don't always, in history, a lot of things get lost. Some of the things that got lost in this story was the brutality of the British against the colonists, against the Americans. In his message that he preached a year later, he said that these soldiers were more like murderers and cutthroats than they were troops of a Christian king. That without provocation, without warning, and no war was proclaimed. Remember that. Okay, no declaration had been signed. They drew a sword of violence upon the inhabitants of this town with a cruelty and barbarity which would have made the most hardened savage blush. They shed innocent blood, but oh my God, how I speak, oh how describe the distress, the horror of an awful morn, that glorious day, or that gloomy day, excuse me. He said, yonder fields can witness the innocent blood of our brethren slain. But he closed out, he said, but they bleed, they die, not in their own cause only, but in the cause of this whole people, and in the cause of God, their country, and posterity. And they have not bled, they shall not bleed in vain. Surely there is one that avengeth, and that will plead the cause of the injured and oppressed. And in his own way and time will both cleanse and avenge their innocent blood. And that's the way he felt about it. And as y'all know, the story didn't end there and the day didn't end there. That was before daylight on that morning, but there was more fighting to be done. As a matter of fact, the British soldiers were having their breakfast about 8 a.m. They had just finished outside the town of Concord, and they were stirring their brandy and water with their fingers, saying before nightfall they'd be stirring more Yankee blood. And there was a lot of bloodshed that day, but most of it wasn't Yankees. That in Concord, the militia came out, and within 2 minutes, they put the British on the run because they were uncertain, and they were shocked at how they killed like 3 right off the bat and injured 8 or 9 more. But guess what? They had to retreat. And on their retreat, they had 5 miles and 2.5 hours of bloodshed as those people that they had just attacked regrouped and fought from their houses, from behind trees and behind rocks, and they picked them off. And at the end of the day, that army was only saved by reinforcements that came, and they had to encircle them, Brother Dwayne. And those men that were in Pitcairn's company, they laid on the ground, exhausted like dogs with their tongues hanging out because of what they had been through. And at the end of the day, there were 49 Americans killed and 39 wounded, 5 missing. For the British, there were 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, for a 20% casualty rate, which is phenomenal. So my point, I guess, today, I want to leave you with this thought is these were ordinary citizens. These weren't soldiers, Brother Roger. And those are the people that want our freedom for us. And I know it's a lot easier, it's even more fun to build something than it is to maintain it. It requires persistence and fortitude to maintain something. And that's what God, I think, is asking of us now, is to protect the liberties that these men had died to get for us and that God has given us by His great mercy.